One point I want to make, well, basically, I think you're underscoring the point about the importance of a political strategy and of the political skill and the choices that leaders make. But I'll now express it in two additional ways. Number one, coming to the writing that Juan Lentz has done, which I think is very insightful and seminal, also a founding member of the board of our Journal of Democracy and one of Seymour Martin Lipset's first PhD students. They were very close colleagues and friends, and I co-edited a series of books with them on democratic experiences in developing countries. So you've seen from this reading, or you will see if you read his book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, that Lentz emphasizes the importance, several of you have made reference to it, of the initial agenda in a new democracy. And setting realistic expectations about what democracy can achieve. And another way of saying this is that a new democracy comes in with very high expectations. There is, a massive legacy of abuse of power, probably massive legacy of human rights violations, corruption, untended social needs, and all the rest. It can't do everything. It can't resolve every problem, relieve every frustration, address every social injustice all at once. And actually, this is a problem I think you should, it's an issue you should press President Toledo on as well. So you come in his case, after the experience of Alberto Fujimori, and, what do you do first? Are you going to expend your time and energy on punishing the human rights violations of the past, on reining in the military, addressing the economy, inequality? You have to develop a realistic agenda, but you've got to at least target some things that can show people that democracy is going to work for them. And the second point I want to make is, I do believe that Steve Fish and others who've written about this, we've published several articles on this in Africa as well, have identified a very important phenomenon in terms of the value to and benefit to democratic quality and survival of constraining executive power and having a strong legislature. But you've got, if you want to achieve reform and change, you also need to empower people who are going to do that. And that means that you can't have a head of government in a new democracy who has so little power, either as a result of the constitutional structure or more commonly as a result of the political situation and the fragility of the coalition, if you will, that he or she is unable to accomplish important reforms. We're going to get into a case study this afternoon where the issue of how you achieve reform in a deeply corrupt environment is something we're going to probe much more intensively, but that's just something for you to think about. Okay, in the remaining half hour, mainly what I'm going to do is go through these slides very quickly, but now I can do so more quickly because of everything you have brought to the table that basically has laid most of the factors and issues out there for our analysis. But in this literature, studying the survival or breakdown of democracy, I do want to underscore again the point that there's basically two approaches. One puts the emphasis on structural factors, and we could add as an element of the structural environment the culture that a country has. They're constraints and drivers of behavior that make it more likely or less likely that democracy will survive. And the other approach, which is the approach in the article or chapter you might have read from Nancy Bermeo in this reading, who was a student of Juan Lentz's, so we're all one big family here. and that is very much Juan Lintz's approach as well, is the approach of the behaviors, the choices, the strategies that key actors make, and particularly elites, who by their skill or bungling, by their ability to forge coalitions or not, by their pursuit of self-interest versus a larger interest, may make democracy feasible or not. Now, I don't think either of these approaches is the answer. Obviously, you can have extremely difficult structural conditions that can make it unlikely that democracy can develop or be sustained. If you don't get the incentives right, in terms of at least encouraging better behavior and imposing costs on abusive behavior or discouraging the narrow pursuit of interests and very narrowly based coalitions, then that can help to explain why you get bad choices and bad behavior that are not conducive to democracy. So we need to think about how to integrate these two approaches. The structural approach, which seems to be very deterministic in that it kind of takes away the variable of human choice and free will, and the actor-centered approach, which suggests that people can do whatever they want and all choices are equally feasible, which is, in fact, in the real world of history, we know not to be the case. So it raises the questions I pose here about when democracy fails, what's driving it? Is it that the conditions were just unfavorable or political leaders drove it into the ground? This is my favorite slide. I torture my students with it every time I teach my course on democracy. And
I think that some points are missing.
Yeah.
You can either torture yourself for the remaining week and a half of your time here at Stanford by trying to take all this in, or frankly just ignore it and move on. But I'll just make the following points. These are all a lot of structural and in some cases cultural factors that may affect the survival of democracy. But in the end, the point I wanted to make is that most of the presumed influences of economic structure, political institutions, and so on, have their effect on the probability of democratic survival by the degree to which they affect the legitimacy of democracy, often by affecting the extent to which democracy can perform well and effectively or not. That's one point. The second point is, I think I've made this point before, but I want to underscore it now. People do not only value economic performance. They very much value what I call political performance as well. And we have some very telling and I think effectively analyzed from a statistical point of view public opinion survey data from multiple different countries and regions of the world that shows us that people's evaluations of the political performance of democracy, is it delivering on its promise of providing people with greater freedom, greater accountability and transparency, control of corruption, political voice, free and fair elections. When people perceive that democracy is working procedurally in the political sense to allow them civic freedom, greater scope for participation, authentic, regular electoral choice, they're more likely to tolerate disappointing economic results and to be more patient with the working of democracy, and that is likely to lead to a stronger sense of the legitimacy of the democratic system. Yeah, I'll like just call on you.
Yeah, I'd like to support that idea with the case of Argentina in the several economic crises we had. in the last couple of years and how democracy was able to survive, even in a context of a very, very high economic crisis in 2001, where, just to give you an idea, we had 5 presidents in 15 days. And then I can tell you how you can achieve that in a very constitutional way. But yes, I totally support the idea that Larry is mentioning.
Great, thank you.
I can see that argument, but
Which argument?
the argument that has just been supported
Okay.
by Fernando. But I always tend to think that people would obviously support all this political liberty, the order and participation with the aim of achieving the greater goal of wellness. And
Human
they think
well-being.
These are just vehicles towards being human well-beingness.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's the ultimate goal anyway. But they believe that these are just vehicles towards achievement of that goal.
that is not what the public opinion survey data suggests. And I would like to encourage you to look at, and I'll actually at the break show you where it is, because there's 1 or 2 essays where you can get it more efficiently. Do you know about the Afro Barometer? Have you seen any of their data?
I've worked with them before.
Okay. So, I mean, the Afro Barometer, which is a public opinion survey of attitudes and values toward democracy in about, probably over 20 African countries now, suggests that there is a strong and growing sense among citizens in different African countries of valuing political freedom, political competition, political accountability as ends in themselves, not just means to escape from poverty. It's not to deny that they're important instruments for improving human well-being, but as I see this evidence and the passion and resilience with which people are embracing these principles, I don't think it's just about getting a better life in material terms. I think it is also seeping deeply into the cultures of these countries that accountability is an intrinsically right and important, principle.
Yeah.
Which may be a very good thing for the future of democracy and the rule of law on the continent.
But given the examples yesterday by Jeremy of Uganda, I mean, someone who doesn't represent them properly and all that, and yet they are re-elected, maybe they managed to buy a few voters.
So let me
here and
just
there.
make a couple of brief comments. First of all, my own sense is I just thought it was an incredibly fascinating lecture yesterday, and Jeremy is a treasured colleague because, first of all, he's such an innovative and able social scientist, and second of all, he's really on the frontier of identifying and knowing where these different studies are. My inclination is to be a little bit more cautious about drawing, strong general conclusions based on specific experimental studies that are so far just in a small number of places. So I think we want to see more evidence and not assume that, for example, Uganda and those experiences will be generalizable to all of Africa. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there is this tendency of people, we see it in the United States, to favor accountability in general and to have a strong desire to get a better parliament. But then when it's your individual representative and you've developed a kind of specific relationship with that individual, you kind of may continue to embrace that person. And so we do have in the United States this perverse situation where 83% of the American public thinks the Congress is doing a bad job. But when they go to the polls in November of 2014, most Americans are going to vote to reelect their representatives, or at least most of the representatives are going to be reelected because, you know, there's a disjunction between their attitude toward the institution as a whole and their attitude toward that specific individual. But anyway, I can't deny that there's a problem here. Okay, the only other point I want to make about this is that there is, you know, a direct relationship here of a non-structural nature between the political leadership and its choices and the stability of democracy. And that is not necessarily mediated by legitimacy. It's an independent effect. So the two things that I think affect the survival of democracy, independent of this factor, that is, to what extent do citizens believe that their democracy should continue, that it's the best form of government, is whether you have civilian control over the military, and the military has become a non-political actor, and the choices and skills of politicians. So I don't think I need to explain in detail or articulate every one of these slides. Lintz's approach is on the side of the actors, the choices they make, and again, how they shape the initial agenda of when they come into power. And one of the distinctive contributions he's made is to introduce the concept of loyalty to democracy. That is, to what extent, independent of all their other policy choices, are political parties, political leaders, members of parliament, and other key elites acting in ways that express loyalty not to their party or their ethnic group or whatever, but to the democratic system and to democracy as a principle. And loyalty means commitment to legal and democratic means, and therefore obviously peaceful means, nonviolent means of pursuing their interests and objectives. And that means not rigging elections. It means not intimidating your opposing party when they come in to campaign in your areas of strength. It means not misusing the institutions of governments to spy on or threaten your political opponents, and not trying to use the military to gain advantage in a political crisis.
Just a point on this particular thing you're talking about. In our case, the military eats up a lot of this loyalty to democratic process by waging our campaigns against the political leaders, and they just say politicians are corrupt, politicians are corrupt. I just want to know if that happens in other countries. Is that a pattern that the military is constantly eating up on this pool reservoir?
So perpetuating a narrative that the whole political class is corrupt.
Yeah.
Any other experience?
I'll just speak about the military in Lebanon. We wish that the military in Lebanon was a bit stronger, because we have the military in Lebanon is like the state in Lebanon. It's the weakest part in whole society. And in fact, whenever we see military, for us, it reassures us. It's just like, oh, they're around. It's good then. But unfortunately, they're not giving them the whole equipment. Would it be politically, because we have Syria and Israel, just like, and even like US, you have a lot of people who wouldn't like to see the Lebanese military like well armed, because they would be afraid for the neighbors. So we don't have, there's not a political, if you want, approval to have like the military, Lebanese military strong. Although we have strong people in the army, like a good army, and at the same time we have so many people who have guns and who are militias in Lebanon. So just like they are taking from the power, if you want, of military. And we have a fear that 1975, when there was the war, the confessional part played a big role, because you had the Christian who were part of the army, who left the army, and they divided the army, and so and they play always on this confession. Now I can say that the army is strong, at least if you want morally, as confessions, it's strong. But the other day, the Salafist, one of the Salafist leaders, he's called Asir, when there was a war in Saida recently, 2 months ago, something like that, he called the Sunnis in the army to defect and to come and join him. So there's always this dream of the little lords of war, that just the army could defect and then the whole institution would go. So I wanted to share this.
Your comment, of course, raises another issue or reinforces an earlier point. If you don't have a state, you can't have a democratic state. And one of the problems for Lebanon has been that the state, including the legitimate armed forces, are so weak and so kind of overawed by non-state militias that it raises profound questions of, first of all, what Lynch and Stepan would call stateness, the degree to which there is a viable and authoritative state. And second of all, democratic, constitutional, lawful control of armed force. In this case, a lot of armed forces that are not within the state structure. But your comment raises another interesting problem that I've thought about a bit because it keeps rising up. So let's say you have a situation where, frankly, the politicians are very corrupt. It's very common. And you get what's been called in Nigeria a political class of politicians and politically connected businessmen who are really just kind of using the state and the political process first and foremost, I mean, not literally exclusively, but first and foremost for their own personal enrichment. You can't just close your eyes to that and say it doesn't matter, particularly when it's draining away the resources that are needed to show that democracy can deliver for people to improve their human well-being. On the other hand, if civil society and the mass media focus only on that or primarily on that and continue and accelerate the drumbeat of cynicism about the politicians as a group, then they can play into a narrative that becomes very useful to the military and to anti-democratic elements who want to overthrow democratic rule, either as a military or maybe as a populist autocrat like Hugo Chavez, who simply wants to conquer power for his own ends.
Our generals are also very corrupt, but that is not talked.
Yes, yes, of course. And that's very dangerous to talk about.
Just one comment about this view of the elite view of Dr. Linz. It doesn't explain the whole picture. And you just mentioned Chavez. Chavez underwent and survived to a military coup in 2002 that it was mainly drew by the elites, with the military, the businessman, and even the media were playing in favor of the coup. And he actually was arrested, but there was something else going on over there that cracks this view, I believe. First, something that we haven't mentioned yet, that is the external factors. Even though the U.S. supported that coup, the entire Latin American governments
Condemned it.
Yeah, condemned the situation, and actually there was a huge mass movement in favor of Chavez. So even though the elites played in favor of the coup, it didn't work out.
Yeah. That's a very distinctive experience, and I think the decision or the choice by his political opponents to try and displace him through the means of a military coup was very ill-considered. And in the end, it made him even stronger and gave him the legitimacy to crack down even harder on the opposition. In any case, Lentz presents this model of what democratic disloyalty is, and it's essentially not playing by the rules of the game. And it's got a lot of different elements. But the issue here for Lentz is that you can talk all you want about culture, about history, about structures, about preconditions, about incentives, but in the end, politics is about the daily march of behavior and decisions, certainly within an environment of structures and institutions that propel people in certain ways. And when we get to Jim Sheehan in the next session, I think you're going to see that he feels that the breakdown of democracy in interwar Germany was not inevitable, that it involved certain decisions that politicians made along these lines that were not the only choices open to them realistically. So bear this in mind. And often the people who do the most damage to democracy are not the extremist elements, okay, that are mobilizing blatantly anti-democratic rhetoric and behavior in a bid to topple democracy, but people who come from more establishment or centrist or moderate political parties who are willing to try and use them more blatant anti-democratic elements, and in some cases the military or radical forces of one kind or another. It could be radical Islamist parties or forces now, for their own ends of trying to entrench themselves in power or to conquer power or whatever. And so Lentz very strongly emphasizes the danger to democracy of this kind of ambiguous, semi-loyal behavior on the part of more mainstream political actors who are willing to ally with, tolerate, cover up for, excuse the actions of more blatantly anti-democratic forces. Now, there's a very good example of this that is unfolding in Tunisia today. An emerging democracy where a Islamist party or moderately Islamist party, Ennahda, won the elections for the Constituent Assembly and have emerged as the leading governing power of the country in this transitional period. We've just had in the last few days the second assassination of a prominent liberal secular or left secular politician in Tunisia. And in fact, the evidence now shows that the bullet that was used, or the bullets that were fired to assassinate this politician, came from the very same gun as the one that was used to assassinate the politician, last year, Chokri Belaid?
6 months ago.
Huh?
6 months ago.
6 months ago, beginning of this year. And so the issue is this. Is the ruling moderately Islamist party in Ennahda engaging in semi-loyal behavior by not going after the presumed authors of these crimes, who are radical Islamists who are trying to derail the transition, because they judge that if they go after these radical Islamists, they'll lose or offend part of their support base. And if, as many people now suspect, that is what's happening, then the ruling party is engaging in semi-loyal behavior that Lentz would argue is frequently the most important factor paving the way for the demise of democracy. So I just lay that out there for your further exploration and consideration. We can identify a few factors that contribute to the survival or failure of new, tentative, uncertain democracies in challenging circumstances. So one is the performance of the government in addressing social and economic problems, the accumulated agenda of unmet needs. The second, which I emphasize to you, is really a political decision on the part of the new leadership to define a reasonable agenda. So Lentz strongly emphasizes that, you know, if you raise expectations unrealistically, if you overpromise in terms of what democracy can deliver, you're setting yourself up for failure. You may, first of all, polarize the country around class or other issues, and you may lead your constituencies to expect too much. So it's better in a way to settle with people honestly early on in terms of leveling with them about the state of the country and what can realistically be achieved in a limited period of time. So an able and shrewd democratic politician early on will bring the public to a certain degree of realism as well as hope. I've mentioned the phenomenon of political performance, which I think is often ignored or underplayed in terms of thinking about the survival of democracy early on. But it's very unusual for a democracy to be overthrown when it's seen to be performing decently, democratically, at least somewhat honestly, in the political realm. Because if people are only unhappy with economic performance, what will they do? Huh?
Start comparing with the past.
Okay, but if it's,
They can wait. Like, they know that.
how will they inflict punishment on the ruling party or register their disapproval if they're unhappy with economic performance in a new democracy?
They won't pay taxes?
Huh?
They won't pay taxes?
They go to streets.
I'm looking for another answer.
We will not be elected again.
Okay.
That's what happened in Bhutan.
That's what happened in Bhutan, and that's what happens in a large number of other democracies, new ones, but of course, old ones like the United States as well. So if you think the system is working democratically, but you're disappointed with the economic performance of the government in power, the political party in power, you've got the ability to punish the ruling party by throwing it out and bringing somebody else in. But if you think the democracy is failing in political terms, that it is not even governing constitutionally, fairly, with some minimal degree of accountability and decency, there's no rule of law, there's chaos in the streets, you're more likely to make or come quickly to a judgment that there's something wrong with the whole system,
Of democracy.
with democracy itself. And so I think early on, trying to obtain better political performance it's not like there's a trade-off. You trade that off against better economic performance. But it's very, very important to the survival of democracy. And I don't think, you can correct me, Sergei, if I'm wrong, that Yanukovych would have been elected if the Orange Revolution coalition had governed better in political terms.
You're right.
Oh, I'm relieved, because I hate to be wrong. Thank you.
For example, in Georgia, you cannot collect even 10 people for a social reason
they are not going for the social reason outside. You cannot do this. It's like impossible.
What do you mean for
Because
social reasons?
if it's like a political, like a regime is something failing, then the people is going outside. For example, to increase the salaries or something like this, they never go there because we are not also the economically very developed countries, and the people are under the poverty line, a lot of them, but they are not going outside for this reason.
So we have discussed already quite a bit, how do you deal with the problem of the old order? And Lintz's advice is quite similar to Samuel Huntington's in the third wave. And of course, this was written in the late 1970s, or I think early 1970s, before Huntington's book. But Lintz, looking at an earlier generation of experiences, came to some very similar pragmatic conclusions. That new democracies basically should not expend too much precious political capital trying to get even with the old authoritarian regime and the people who abused power in it. Because what happens when you move very aggressively against the military or the former authoritarian ruling party, you're going to basically turn them against the system and make them enemies of it, or what he calls disloyal opposition. And so, again, I want to underscore, my own view is pursue as much justice and accountability as you can, as you have the power to do. But his point is, Lintz is, in the circumstances of a new democracy emerging out of an old authoritarian order, there's usually a lot of fragility. And the power situation may not be that favorable for the new democratic authority. So don't make gratuitous enemies. Don't alienate more people than you absolutely need to. And try and draw in ambivalent groups that might have supported the old order, but not been the primary agents of it. And a good example here is in Argentina, or Pakistan for that matter, where you've had civilians who served as ministers in the military regimes. If you say you're morally tainted, maybe we need to prosecute you just because you served in civilian capacity in the old regime, then you can turn these people against the new regime when their support could be very valuable to the democracy. So you want to try and widen the circle of commitment to the new political order. And then I've shared with you Huntington's approach already. Go after a limited number of authoritarian offenders, but don't alienate the whole military as an institution. Try and make a separation between maybe the more senior officers with direct command responsibility for the most serious abuses and the rest of the officer corps that you want to draw into a new ethic. Have a full accounting of what happened, but realistically assess your power so that you don't pursue a scope of prosecution for the crimes of the past that might provoke people into challenging the legitimacy of the new democracy or trying to subvert it. So this is, I think, a realistic agenda for pursuing civilian control over the military. You know, you've got to move in steps. As I said before, if you try and do everything at once, you may overreach and it may backfire. But an early step should be to depoliticize the military and get it out of politics. And then gradually you want to professionalize the military and draw back its activities to focus on its mission of defending the country and the national interest and its borders and its sea lanes and so on and so forth. Then you want to get the military out of internal security and domestic intelligence. You don't want the military spying on people internally. Gradually, you can retire some of the older officers who were associated with or might have served in a military or authoritarian regime, bring up the younger and mid-career officers, change their curricula in the military academies, give them respect, give them pay, give them professional dignity and status, but get them out of being involved with politics. And then at a later stage, you extend civilian control and oversight even over military budgets, weapons acquisitions, and big issues of strategy. Those should not be purely military decisions.
Larry?
Just one, let me just get through this one slide. A lot of what's been written, I am distilling here from many sources, emphasizes the need, again, for a politically led strategy on the part of civilians that combines pragmatism in terms of sequencing these steps with the overarching long-term principle of democratic civilian control. Timing is very important here. Opportunities arise in a way that is difficult to generalize across cases. And it depends on, when certain generals might be retiring or disappear from the scene, on when the balance of power and of societal attitudes may shift in favor of the Democrats that create new opportunities for action. And I will repeat that the more the transition was negotiated or pacted, the more that Democrats may need to move gradually and incrementally in order to achieve these goals. Sorry, Dala.
No, thank you. I just wanted to have your view on the Tunisian army, because I think they played a good role in the revolution, and still now just like they're strong but not that strong like in Egypt. So I just wanted to have your view on that.
Yes, I agree. What the Tunisian military did was noteworthy in two respects. Number one, the dictator Ben Ali tried to get them to fire on the people, and they refused. And number two, when his regime collapsed and he was forced into exile, they could have seized power for themselves, and they didn't. That's a very positive legacy for the future. Yeah?
We spoke about transition to democracy, and you said that it takes time. Do you have any statistics on the average time that the democratic states were built? Like in Armenia?
The average time they take for what?
For building democracy. In Armenia, we believe that it's a generation, and different people would understand them differently.
500
Like 25.
So there are two ways of phrasing, of conceiving of that, the average time it takes to build democracy. One is to say, okay, what is the average time until democracy becomes consolidated? If you even believe that consolidation is a useful concept, which I do. And so that means how long does it take for democracy to seep so deeply into popular values and expectations, to become so legitimate in terms of popular commitment to it on the part of the people at large and all the key elite groups, that it's very difficult to imagine democracy failing for any internal reason. I mean, maybe there could be a war or something or some exogenous shock. And the second way of framing this is, how long does it take to get a very high quality democracy? Building democracy, as you use the term, could be seen as just a lifelong goal. I mean, I don't think we're done building democracy in the United States. But in terms of how long it takes to consolidate democracy, which I think is something that is measurable and observable in terms of the scope and depth and spread of democratic legitimacy, that varies dramatically. In Central and Eastern Europe, I think it happened very quickly, partly because of the level of economic development, because of the Western orientation, because of the incentives generated by the process of accession to the EU and into NATO. But in some emerging democracies, in poor countries where they're not locked into place by the regional and international environment, it might be, you know, a process that proceeds very fitfully, unevenly, gradually, not in a linear fashion, over 20 or 30 years. So I just think it varies by the country. There are a number of factors that I'm trying to call attention to here. One of them, of course, is political institutions. And I'll simply say here, because it's relevant to the next case study of Germany in the interwar period, that some institutional designs can incline a country in a more difficult direction in terms of managing conflict. And if you have what Lentz calls polarized pluralism, a situation where the electoral system and the political institutional arrangements are driving politics toward the extremes, say left and right, then that can make it much more difficult to sustain democracy. And so this is why Germany shifted away from an extreme form of proportional representation, which is where they had, what they had in the interwar period that Jim Sheehan is going to talk about, to a system of more moderate proportional representation that would result in fewer parties. I'm going to skip this slide of Israel just because I've already talked about it. I don't have the time now. But the point is, you want to be mindful when you design the electoral system and design electoral institutions and more broadly political institutions, of the incentives they're creating toward behavior that will be either more conducive to the stable functioning and survival of democracy or not. What we see when democracies fail are some characteristic phenomena, such as an accumulation of unsolvable problems and the political leaders and institutions not being able to address them. Political violence is a very important one. So just dealing with internal security, but obviously the economy is another. Frequently political paralysis. The government is deadlocked and can't deal with these problems, often because of severe polarization on ideological or ethnic lines. People start defecting from the democratic rules of the game. There's electoral fraud and violence and an abandonment of kind of rule of law and democratic norms. And then it becomes impossible to change a bad government because they start violating the rules and rigging the elections in a way that you can't remove them from power through conventional democratic means. Or you get one weak and ineffective government after another, succeeding one another until people throw up their hands.